My name is Clara, and I never imagined that my life would end up like this. I had always thought that I would grow old with my husband, James. We had been together for over 8 years. Our life, from the outside, looked perfect. We had a beautiful house, a stable job, and dreams of the future. But behind that picture of perfection, things were not as they seemed. A few years ago, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness. At first, James was supportive. He would take care of me when I was too weak to move or too tired to get out of bed. But as time went on, I could see his patience starting to wear thin. My illness took a toll on our relationship. The person I had once been, the strong, independent woman, began to fade away, and all that was left was someone who needed constant care and attention. I could see how it frustrated James, how he grew angry when I couldn't keep up with the life we had planned. I tried my best to fight the illness and keep things normal, but it felt like no matter how hard I tried, things just kept slipping away. One evening, after a long day when I could hardly even get out of bed, James came home and gave me the worst news I could ever imagine. He told me he was leaving. He said he couldn't handle my illness anymore. He said I needed space, and so, did he? I was shocked. I couldn't understand how the man who promised to love me through sickness and health could just walk away when things got tough. I begged him to stay, but he refused. Then, without warning, James drove me to a remote cabin that we had once visited as a getaway. He said he was taking some time to clear his mind, and I could stay there until I figured things out. As he turned to leave, his words were cold, like there was no warmth left in him for me. "You'll be fine," he said. "I just can't do this anymore." And with that, he left me, alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to rely on but myself. As I stood there, watching him drive away, I felt completely lost. Not only was I physically alone in the wilderness, but I also felt like I had been abandoned emotionally. The man I loved had left me when I needed him most. In that moment, I thought I had lost everything. But little did I know, the days ahead would teach me things about myself I had never imagined. This was just the beginning of a journey I never expected to take, a journey of survival, not only in the wilderness, but also within myself. The car's tires crunched over the gravel as James pulled up to the small cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had been here before, years ago, when we used to come for weekends away, just the two of us. But now, the place felt completely different. The warmth and love I once felt here had vanished, replaced by a cold emptiness. James didn't say a word as he parked the car. I could see the frustration in his eyes, but there was no hint of guilt, no soft touch to comfort me. He didn't even look back as he got out and opened the trunk, unloading my things without a second glance. As he handed me my suitcase, he muttered, "You'll be fine here. I need time to figure things out." "James, please." I started, but my voice cracked. I didn't know what to say anymore. What could I say? He was already halfway down the path, not even looking back. I watched him drive off, his car disappearing into the distance, leaving me alone. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind. For a long moment, I stood frozen at the doorstep of the cabin, my heart heavy with disbelief. My mind couldn't process it all. How could he just leave me? Abandon me like this? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. I had to stay calm. I had to survive. But how? How was I supposed to survive out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal, no internet, and barely any supplies? The cabin was small and simple, and while it was cozy, it was far from luxurious. There was enough food for a few days, a wood stove to keep warm, and a few blankets on bed, but nothing more. It was a place to escape, not to live for weeks or months. As I entered the cabin, the cold air hit me. The heater was off, and I couldn't figure out how to start the fire in the stove. I stared at the pile of firewood next to it, unsure of what to do next. The panic was starting to creep in, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I had to stay calm. I tried to make a cup of tea, but my hands were shaking too much. I dropped the mug twice before finally getting it filled. The warmth of the tea did nothing to calm the storm inside me, though. As I sipped it slowly, my eyes wandered around the room. The walls were lined with pictures of James and me. from happier times. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. This wasn't what I had imagined when I thought of our future together. Hours passed, but time seemed to slow. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the windows. I tried to focus on the small things, things that would keep me busy and distracted. I unpacked a few of my belongings and set them around the cabin, trying to make it feel like home. But every time I moved, every time I did something that should have felt comforting, I was reminded of the fact that I was alone. The silence in the cabin was overwhelming. I would hear a branch crack outside, or the wind whistle through the cracks in the door, and it made me jump. I wasn't used to this much stillness. Back home, the city was always alive, noisy, and busy. But here, in the middle of the wilderness, everything felt too quiet, too empty. The nightfall brought with it the fear of being alone. I locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't help. I knew no one would come, not for a long time, and then the darkness of the wilderness seemed to press in on me. The isolation was no longer just physical. It was mental and emotional, too. I tried to call James. My fingers hovered over the phone, but there was no signal. I tried again and again, but nothing. I was cut off from the world. No one could hear me. No one could help me. I tried to eat dinner, but my appetite was gone. My body felt weak, and my illness was getting worse. I could feel it, like a storm building inside me, the constant pain that I could never quite escape from. The illness was always there, always reminding me that it was a part of me, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Sitting by the small table in the cabin, I let out a shaky breath and wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. I was trying so hard to stay strong, but every step I took toward survival felt like a huge battle. My body wasn't cooperating, my mind was overwhelmed, and I felt so lost. The night dragged on, and eventually, I couldn't fight it anymore. I climbed into bed, wrapping myself in the warm blankets, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what James had done to me. I thought about how he had promised to love me in sickness and in health, and now I was here alone. The betrayal stung like a fresh wound, and it didn't matter how many times I tried to push the thought away. It kept coming back, sharper than before. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, but the peace I craved was nowhere to be found. The isolation wasn't just about being alone in the wilderness. It was about being abandoned by the person I had trusted the most. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my new reality. Alone, the days seemed to drag on in the wilderness, but the more time I spent alone, the clearer my thoughts became. The cabin, with its quiet stillness and isolation, had become both a prison and a refuge. In the beginning, I fought the loneliness, struggled with the silence, and cursed the circumstances that had led me here. But as the days blurred into weeks, something unexpected started to happen. I began to change. At first, I still clung to the old version of myself, the woman who had once been full of dreams, ambitions, and love for a life she thought would last forever. I replayed the memories of James and me, thinking of how he had supported me at first when my illness had started to take over my life, how he would hold me when the pain was unbearable and tell me that everything would be okay. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that those moments had faded into the background long before he left me. The reality of what had been happening in our marriage for months, maybe even years, slowly began to settle in. James hadn't just left me physically in that cabin. He had already left me emotionally long before. I had become a shadow of the woman I once was, seeking validation and love from someone who no longer saw me as his equal. I had allowed my illness to define me, to limit me, and to push me into a space where I felt weak and incapable. But I wasn't weak. I wasn't just my illness. In the days that followed, I realized how much I had been holding on to a version of myself that no longer existed. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into the world of expectations that I had lost sight of the woman I truly was. The woman who was strong enough to survive this. The woman who had dreams of her own, separate from anyone else. The woman who could find joy in the small things, even in the middle of a wilderness. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. In the beginning, I still cried at night, still felt abandoned and betrayed. My illness would flare up, and I would lie in bed, shaking with pain, wondering how much more I could take. But with each passing day, I forced myself to move forward. I couldn't control the illness, but I could control how I responded to it. I could choose to let it break me, or I could choose to fight. One of the first things I had to learn was how to take care of myself in ways I never had before. In the past, when I was sick, I would lean on James, rely on him to take care of me, to comfort me, to make everything better. But now, I had to be my own source of strength. There was no one else to rely on, and that was terrifying. I started small. In the mornings, I would get up and stretch my aching limbs, even when it hurt. I would make my bed, even when I didn't want to. I began to appreciate the simple act of survival. Getting through the day became an accomplishment. Every time I managed to light the stove and prepare a meal, it felt like a victory. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to take a walk outside. The wilderness was intimidating at first. The trees seemed endless, and the sounds of wildlife echoed through the air. But when I stepped out into the crisp morning air and felt the warmth of the sun on my face, I realized how disconnected I had been from the world around me. I had been so focused on the pain, on my illness, and on James's abandonment that I hadn't stopped to take in the beauty of the world I was still part of. I began to walk every morning, pushing myself further each time. The physical exertion was hard on my body, but it was good for my soul. Every time I climbed a hill or crossed a stream, I felt more alive. I felt more like myself. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about rediscovering the strength I had inside, a strength I had forgotten I had. The more time I spent in nature, the more I realized how much I had taken for granted before. In the past, I had been so focused on the busy world around me, on the career and the life I thought I wanted, that I had neglected to take care of myself. Now, I was learning to live in the moment. I was learning to listen to the rhythms of my body, to respect my limitations, but also to celebrate the progress I made. It wasn't just physical strength that I was gaining. It was mental and emotional strength too. As I spent more time in silence, my mind began to clear. The noise of the world that had once drowned out my thoughts was gone, and for the first time in a long time, I could hear my own voice. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that had been drowned out by my illness, by my dependence on James, and by the demands of life I didn't even want anymore. I started to meditate in the evenings. I found a quiet spot by the window where I could see the sunset, and I would sit there, breathing in the cool air, letting my thoughts settle. I realized that in those quiet moments, I was reconnecting with myself. I was no longer the woman who needed constant reassurance. I was a woman who could stand alone, who could face her fears and uncertainties and still find peace. One evening, as I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. I was no longer defined by my illness. I was no longer defined by James's abandonment. I was Clara, a woman who had been through something difficult, but who had come out stronger on the other side. In those quiet moments, I realized that my survival wasn't about physically being strong enough to withstand the wilderness. It was about finding the strength within to embrace who I truly was, to let go of the past, and to move forward without fear. I had spent so much time thinking that I needed someone else to complete me, someone to make me feel whole. But I realized that I was already whole. I was already enough. The wilderness, with its quiet stillness and vast beauty, had shown me a truth I had forgotten. I didn't need anyone else to survive. I just needed myself. And with that realization, I felt a wave of freedom. I was ready to leave the past behind and embrace the future, whatever it might hold. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace with who I was. The days had started to blend together, one after another in a peaceful rhythm, as I settled into the routine of life alone in the wilderness. The isolation that had once felt suffocating was now a source of solace. I had learned to respect my limits, cherish the small victories, and discover a side of myself that had been buried for years. I felt stronger, more connected to myself and the world around me than I had ever been. But, as with all periods of calm, a storm was waiting on the horizon. It began with a sound. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. the eerie silence of the wilderness breaking into some phantom noise. But it came again, louder this time, a low hum, followed by the rumbling of an engine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. A car. Who would be out here? I quickly scrambled to the window, my heart racing. The familiar sight of the long dirt road leading to the cabin stretched out in front of me, but there was no sign of any vehicle. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Could it be James? Had he come back? The thought both terrified and confused me. Why would he return now, after everything he'd done? The rumbling sound grew louder, and this time I could see the dust rising in the distance. I squinted against the sunlight and saw a vehicle approaching. A truck, not James's car. I didn't recognize the vehicle, and the sight of it filled me with both curiosity and apprehension. I stood frozen, not knowing whether to hide or to face whatever, or whoever, was coming. My first instinct was to lock the door and stay inside. After all, I had been alone for so long. The world outside felt like a distant memory. I had come to appreciate the isolation, and the idea of having anyone, invade that space felt unsettling. But something inside me told me to go outside, to face whatever was coming. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, or maybe it was just that nagging curiosity. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The truck came to a stop in front of the cabin, kicking up a cloud of dust as it idled. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a rugged face that looked like it had seen hard work. His jeans were dusty, and his boots were worn. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though he was familiar with the area. I didn't know whether to greet him or retreat inside. The fear I had felt earlier slowly morphed into something else, something deeper, more profound. My stomach churned as he took a few steps toward me. "Are you Clara?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I nodded, hesitant. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" "My name's Ben," he said, his eyes lingering on me as though assessing my every move. "I'm a ranger. I've been checking the cabins out here for some routine maintenance, and I saw your place on the list." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. A ranger. A legitimate reason for someone to be here. But then, something about the way he said maintenance made me wonder if there was more to the story. I hadn't requested any work on the cabin, and it seemed odd that someone would be sent out to check on me. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Ben hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I was actually sent to check on you," he said. "We've had reports from neighbors about someone living out here. They've been concerned, given the fact that you're so far out. There was no word of anyone else with you, and we just wanted to make sure you were all right." The sudden realization hit me, like a blow to the chest. Neighbors? Who could be concerned about me? I had lived alone in this place for weeks, cut off from everything and everyone. No one knew I was here. As if sensing my confusion, Ben continued. "It's not unusual for someone to come up here for some peace and quiet, but when we got a call about a woman living alone in the area, we thought it was best to check." I swallowed hard, trying to process his words. It felt surreal, like I had been trapped in a bubble of my own making, and now the outside world was intruding. Who had called? Why hadn't anyone contacted me directly before this? Before I could ask more questions, Ben stepped closer. "Look, Clara, I don't want to alarm you, but the ranger station has been getting reports of unusual activity in this area. Suspicious cars, people out here who shouldn't be. I've been assigned to keep an eye on things, but I want to make sure you're okay." The last few weeks of isolation came rushing back to me. The silence, the stillness, the sense that I was hidden away from the world, protected from any danger. But now it was all being shattered. Something had changed, and I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of fear that had taken root in my chest. "Do you think someone's out there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ben replied, "but it's better to be safe than sorry. The next few days might be a little unpredictable. I suggest you stay inside, lock up tight, and keep the phone nearby. If you need anything, call me." Ben handed me a small card with his contact information before turning to leave. He didn't seem suspicious, but the weight of his words lingered in the air long after he drove off. As the truck disappeared down the dirt road, I stood on the porch, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The momentary sense of safety I had found here, alone in the wilderness, was slipping away. I had once felt at peace in this isolation, but now everything felt uncertain. What had changed? What was really going on? I turned back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I had spent so much time fighting the isolation, learning to live without anyone. But now, the wilderness didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a place I could no longer control. I wasn't alone, not anymore. The silence that followed was no longer comforting. It was heavy with the unknown. I had thought that being abandoned by James was the hardest thing I would ever have to endure. But the truth was, I had only begun to face the reality of what I had been running from. The quiet was over, and something told me that this was only the beginning. The days after Ben's visit were unsettling. The tranquility I had once found in my solitude had vanished, replaced by a constant sense of unease. The small cabin that had become my refuge now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper wind outside, felt like a reminder that the world was no longer a distant memory. It was closing in. The isolation that had brought me peace was now the thing I feared most. Ben's warnings echoed in my mind. Suspicious activity, unseen people, the unknown. I had chosen this remote cabin to escape the chaos of my life, to find a place where I could heal from the abandonment and betrayal of James. But now, it seemed the world wasn't as far away as I thought. I had once believed that isolation was my choice, my sanctuary. But now it felt like a choice made for me by forces beyond my control. I tried to push the fear down, to focus on the small steps I had made in reclaiming my strength. I still went on my walks through the woods, but now I did so with a heightened sense of awareness, constantly looking over my shoulder. Who was out there? The feeling of being watched never left me. One afternoon, I decided to venture back into town. I hadn't left the cabin for weeks, but the idea of seeing other people, even if it was just a quick trip to the general store, felt like a way to reconnect with the world I had left behind. I knew I couldn't stay in this isolated cabin forever, no matter how much it had helped me find myself. I needed to face the world again. The drive to the small town took longer than I remembered. The roads were winding and the scenery was breathtaking, but my mind was preoccupied. As I neared the town, I noticed the first signs of life in what had once been a deserted place. Cars parked in front of buildings, people walking along the sidewalks. It was a stark contrast to the solitude I had gotten used to, and yet it felt strangely comforting. When I arrived at the small general store, I parked the car and stepped out. The familiar smell of fresh bread and coffee wafted from inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and for a moment, I felt like I was stepping into another life, one that felt almost like a dream. The store was quiet, with only a few people milling about. I walked down the aisles, trying to focus on picking up a few necessities, bread, eggs, and some fruit. But as I reached the checkout counter, something strange happened. The elderly woman behind the register looked up at me with a knowing smile. "Well, Clara," she said, her voice warm but laced with something deeper. "Been a while since we've seen you around here." I froze. How did she know my name? Yes," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "I've been away for a while." "Not just away, dear," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Word around here is that you've been hiding out in that cabin. Some folks have been wondering if you're doing okay." I felt a jolt of panic rush through me. So people were talking about me. Why would they be concerned? I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning my face, as though she could see the anxiety building inside me. "Well, it's not often that someone goes out there by themselves, especially after what happened with your husband." The words hit me like a slap in the face. James. Of course, people had heard about our separation. The town was small, and news traveled fast. But hearing it from a stranger made it feel real, as if the entire world had been watching me fall apart. I had been running from my pain, thinking I could escape it, but it seemed like it was always just a few steps behind me, catching up at every turn. I forced a smile, trying to downplay the tension in my body. "I'm fine, really," I said, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. The woman's eyes softened. "You know, sometimes it helps to talk to someone. If you need anything, we're here. You don't have to face it all on your own." I nodded, unsure what to say. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me as I left the store, the conversation lingering in my mind like a cloud I couldn't shake. People were watching me. People knew. As I drove back to the cabin, the weight of the world seemed to come crashing back. The sense of peace I had felt in the wilderness was slipping through my fingers. For so long, I had convinced myself that I was fine, that I had everything under control. But the truth was, I had been running from the reality of my life, from the fact that James had abandoned me, from the loneliness that had crept into my soul. I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't hide in the wilderness forever. It was time to face the world and face myself. It was time to stop pretending I had it all figured out. Back at the cabin, I unpacked the few groceries I had bought, my mind racing with everything I had learned. It was clear to me now that I had to start making choices, not just survive, but to truly live again. I had spent so much of my life depending on others, on James, on the hope that everything would just fall into place. But the reality was, life didn't work that way. No one was going to come and fix things for me. I had to fix them myself. Over the next few days, I started to make changes. I didn't know exactly what my future held, but I began to take small steps toward moving forward. I reached out to old friends, sent a few messages, and even called a counselor. The thought of facing my feelings, of confronting the past, made me nervous, but I knew I couldn't keep running from it. I also realized that while I had been focusing so much on my pain, I had forgotten to see the potential in the world around me. The wilderness wasn't just a place for hiding. It was a place for growth. I had learned so much about myself, and now I needed to take that knowledge and use it to build something new. James wasn't coming back. The life I had imagined with him was gone, but I was still here, and I could still make something beautiful out of the ashes of what had been. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I sat on the porch of the cabin, taking in the beauty of the world around me. I had spent so many years trying to live up to expectations, my own and others, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free to be myself. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew there would be challenges, but I also knew that I was stronger than I had ever realized. I wasn't the woman who had been abandoned and left to fend for herself. I was Clara, the woman who had faced her fears, discovered her inner strength, and was ready to live a life that was truly hers. And that, for the first time, felt like enough. The days following my return to the world were full of uncertainty, but also of unexpected clarity. I had spent so much of my life thinking I needed someone else to complete me, to validate me, and to make me feel whole. I had allowed my illness and the abandonment of James to define me, but the wilderness had shown me something different. I was whole on my own. I wasn't just surviving, I was becoming. The cabin had been a place of isolation and pain, but it had also been where I rediscovered my strength. It was where I learned that I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough. I had the power to take care of myself, to heal, and to rebuild my life from the ground up. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether I was strong enough to face the world again. But with each step I took, each connection I made, I realized that I was not the person who had been left behind in that cabin. I was a new version of myself, one who no longer defined herself by the past or the people who had walked away. I had faced the deepest loneliness and come out stronger for it. My past had shaped me, but it no longer controlled me. When I reconnected with old friends, when I spoke to a counselor and started talking to pain, I realized that there were so many parts of me that I had forgotten. My laughter, my joy in simple things, my desire to help others. It had all been buried under the weight of my illness and the disappointment I had felt from James's abandonment. But as I rebuilt my life, I rediscovered those pieces of myself. And with each rediscovery, I grew more confident, more certain that my future was in my hands. I knew that there would still be moments when I would miss the life I had once dreamed of. There would be days when the loneliness would creep back in. But now, I understood that loneliness wasn't something to run from. It was something to live with. It was a part of my journey, but not the whole of it. James's departure had been painful. It felt like a betrayal that cut deep into my soul. But in the end, his leaving had given me the space to find myself again. The truth was, I had never really needed him to define my worth. The world was vast, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. I wasn't sure what my future held, whether I would meet someone new, whether my illness would continue to affect my life in ways I couldn't predict. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had the tools to face whatever came next. As I stood at the edge of the wilderness, looking out at the vast expanse of the world before me, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I was ready to walk it, alone but not lonely, strong but still open to whatever came next. And for the first time in years, I felt free. This was my new beginning.